The lead person for the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, Chairman of the Budget Committee, Senator Patty Murray from Washington State.
Morning.
Senator,
I thought when you said Washington weather, you were talking about my Washington State weather.
Wait. We have your weather here. It's raining, and what is it right now in Seattle?
80 in Seattle, so something happened. I don't know.
We have sort of messed up the Washingtons there. Somebody needs to realize which Washington's supposed to get rain. All right, simple question to begin this with. Where are we in the Senate, in the budget negotiating process?
Well, as you know, I became chair of the Senate Democrats in January this year and of the Budget Committee, and began to put together a budget which is now passed out of the Senate. The House has passed their budget, and in a regular order world, which they have been calling for a long time, we would appoint conferees in the Senate, the House would appoint conferees, and we would begin to sit down in an open, transparent way and work towards a compromise. But unfortunately, at this point, the Republicans are objecting to us going to conference. So I find myself in a very difficult position, unable to negotiate a deal forward.
So have you started, no formal conversations have begun with Paul Ryan, who is your counterpart on the House side. Have you had informal conversations with him?
Paul has asked that he and I meet together and discuss some of the issues out there, but you know, we've been through this world before where if you're in a closed room and there's two of you, you're not going to get to a deal. This involves all of Congress, it involves all of the country, and the country really needs to see what the alternatives are. You know, when the reason that a budget is important is it really outlines our path forward in the country. It defines where we're going to be and who we are, what our investments are, how we're going to manage our debt and deficit. It defines not just today, but tomorrow. We can't do that with two people in the room. We need to have people from both sides coming together to compromise. That's what legislation is all about.
All right. Even folks in this room might be a little bit confused by all the various budgets that are out. So you guys have a budget, House Republicans have a budget, and the president has a budget. What's the common ground between all three right now? You've probably studied all of these budgets as well as anybody. What's the common ground where we could begin the negotiating process? Well,
that's a really good question, and I think that obviously the House budget and the Senate budget and the President's budget, which is similar to ours, are fairly far apart. I think the common thread is that we all recognize that the debt and deficit is impacting our country's ability to really make sure that our economy is on track, that we have, we know where we're going to go, that businesses have certainty, and that we need to find a path forward. I think the important part that we are looking for is a balance in solving this issue, in making sure that everybody in America participates in helping to solve this problem. That's why the word balance is so important to us, that there are both spending reductions and revenue, which every bipartisan committee has supported, to move forward with.
Why doesn't your budget balance?
Well, in fact, our budget moves us towards balance. And if you go back and look at Simpson-Bowles and all of the Domenici-Rivlin, every bipartisan recommendation that has been put on the table doesn't put out an artificial date to a zero balance. And the reason is because our economy is extremely fragile today. If we were to just immediately put an arbitrary date and cut, trillions from our budget, we would really impact a lot. We're actually starting to see a small part of that with the bad policy of sequestration that has been imposed upon us because we don't have a budget yet. And we're going to see more of that effect as it moves forward. It's extremely important that we get our economy strong again, that we provide security to people, that we get back on track as a country, and manage our finances in the long run.
You said that the president's budget and your budget are pretty similar, but there's one glaring difference, and that is this issue of entitlements, the so-called chain CPI, which would change the way cost of living is done. you have some Republicans criticizing it as a tax increase because it would change tax brackets, but it would hit Social Security benefits. This is not very popular among members of your party. Is that fair to say?
No, it's not popular, and I think that it does have a huge impact on seniors and their Social Security when everyone agrees it's not Social Security that caused the deficit. The president has said his budget is not a perfect solution, but he put that out there as a way to say, my door is open to finding some compromise here. And I think what he is waiting for, what I'm waiting for, I think what Democrats in general are waiting for, is for the Republicans to walk through that door and say, you've compromised a bit, we're willing to compromise on the revenue side.
So do you think that the Republicans aren't interested in entitlement reform?
Are not interested in it.
Are they really interested in it because they don't have a plan out, or do you think that it's...
The only thing to judge them on right now is the Ryan budget, which is, we all know, voucherizes Medicare, which is, that's, you know, just not going to happen. I think that in this country, in this time, in the history of Medicare and where our country is, we know that Medicare is extremely important to provide stability, security, and medical care for seniors today and in the long run. The question is, how do we do Medicare policy for the long run to make sure that it is solvent in the future, which we have, as a party, said we know we need to do. We're willing to put some ideas on the table.
What's an idea that isn't in this budget, isn't in the president's budget, but that you'd be put on the table?
Well, actually, I would disagree with you. In our Senate-passed budget, we put in an additional $275 billion in reduction in Medicare over the next 10 years. And that is a significant give. We recognize on our committee that we have a number of people, Senator Warner, Senator Whitehouse.
Where are you getting this money, by the way? Is this coming out of reimbursements to doctors? Is this out of hospitals, or is this from people that pay in?
A budget document merely says the top line numbers and directs the Finance Committee to it. But I can tell you, having chaired the Super Committee, numerous conversations that we went through line by line to say what are the changes that can be made that don't impact beneficiaries, but that make the problem, solve the problem in the long run. President Clinton was here earlier this morning talking about some of the ways that we need to look at health care in the future, not just for our Medicare population, but for our entire country. It's consuming our country at this time in terms of expenses. We as Democrats are willing to look at those long-term proposals and to make adjustments in our programs and to determine how we can do that. But again, we can't solve this problem just on the backs of Medicare and senior citizens and hardworking families. Everybody has to participate in this debt and deficit problem that we have. That's why revenue is so important.
Is there anything that's a non-starter when it comes to entitlements? Is it raising the age on Medicare? Is it raising the age on Social Security?
Absolute non-starter is the voucher for Medicare proposal, which simply shifts the costs and creates a system that is not sustainable in the future. So, you know, we're not going to undo Medicare with changes, but we certainly can look at ways to reduce the costs overall.
And anything that's a non-starter, could you grudgingly accept what the president did on chain CPI, on Social Security, if it's part of a larger deal?
Well, I think, again, I don't think that's a good solution. I actually think most people don't think it's a good solution within this, but it's a starting point he put out there as a discussion on what we
politically, if he's putting it out there, you guys own it. Is that?
Well, I think it's actually a Republican proposal to start with, but now they're saying they don't support it because it raises revenue. So maybe it is a non-starter because everybody agrees they're not going to go there. But I think there are a lot of other things that we can look at in terms of getting our debt to a manageable place in this country. And again, this is really important. Look, by not having a budget deal today, I mean, it's Washington, D.C. speak, but by not having a budget today, what it means to businesses and families is that they are having to live with very bad budget decisions. Sequestration is a very bad policy. We are beginning to see the effects of that, and it's going to roll out more in the coming months and in the following years if we don't replace sequestration with a budget proposal that defines where we're going to make our cuts and where we're going to make our investments and where the revenue is going to come from.
When is it going to take a crisis again? Is the debt ceiling coming up actually something that everybody in this process needs in a weird way, because it sort of forces action. It seems like the only time that any deal has happened is when there has been the proverbial gun to the head of Washington.
Well, if there's nothing else I say today that's important, let me say this. Our country is tired of Congress managing by crisis. It has brought us to the point where we are at today with bad policies, bad implementation, sequestration being the most visible right now. And I believe that we have a job as Congress, and I think we should get to work putting together a budget. That's why going to conference is so important to me and to my caucus, and to many Republicans that I talk to as well, because managing by crisis puts our country in a very bad place when our economy is fragile. Compromise is not a bad word. It is part of what we have to do in this country. I come from a big family. We have 7 kids growing up. I mean, you don't get what you want for dinner every night. But you realize that sometimes, you know, you have to make changes.
So what happened? You've been at you've actually been, arguably, you were in, or you've already been in a conference committee on this, super committee.
Sure.
You brought it up. There were key Republicans. I mean, this was 6 and 6, if I'm not mistaken. 3 from sort of every caucus, so 6 Democrats. You were the chair there. What went wrong? If you guys couldn't solve it then when the sequestration gun was to your head, how is conference going to go any different between you and Paul Ryan?
Well, I think several things. First of all, what we ran into, having worked many, many hours to try and come up with an agreement, was a line in the sand from the Republicans that no revenue would be included. And we just could not solve this entire problem on the backs of a working class public who was struggling so much from the economic disaster that occurred. That wouldn't be fair, it wouldn't be balanced, it wouldn't be what the public was asking for. What changes today? Well, we had an election where the public said, yes, we want a balanced approach. We want both spending reductions and we want revenue.
And Republicans would say, you got revenue. You got $600 billion worth of revenue.
And I will remind everybody 2 things. Every bipartisan group that put together a proposal recommended much higher revenue than just the $600 billion. We are asking for those kinds of balanced proposals moving forward. And secondly, what we're talking about today in our Senate budget is closing some tax loopholes that even Republicans, Speaker Boehner and Paul Ryan, have said wasteful spending. We spend so much time in Congress going after cuts to discretionary spending and calling them earmarks. We have the same kind of earmarks and tax expenditures that need to be looked at, and are they good for our economy? Are they benefiting just one class of people? Are they working for all of us? And that's the discussion that Speaker Boehner has agreed we need to do, but they will not include it in, their proposal.
You just brought up tax reform, so it segues to our Facebook question, which is from Lisa Burke from Seattle. I believe we need a combination of revenue and spending cuts to address our debt. Is tax reform the solution to getting revenues without setting off a firestorm about new taxes? So it sounds like what she's saying is, can there be a static or lowering of rates that raises the revenue you're looking for? Can everything be accomplished that way?
Well, and what she is also putting forward is the premise that we need both spending cuts and revenue. And the question is fair and legitimate, and in fact, in the super committee and in our Senate budget, we have looked at tax reform as a way of bringing revenue to help solve the deficit problem. The difference right now is that the proposal that the Republicans are looking at does tax reform only to cut the rates for the wealthiest Americans, to give them a tax break. We are talking about tax reform, closing loopholes, looking at tax expenditures to help balance our budget, which benefits the entire country and sets us on a better path.
You know, you keep talking about widening it. You know, there's been some. Is there enough individuals paying taxes into the government? You know, you hear this argument sometimes on the Republican side that everybody needs to pay more of their fair share on this front. So the idea of the different. Do you think a tax reform deal that sort of has people in lower income contributing some tax dollar is something that gets through?
I think what the Republicans are proposing is lowering the rates on wealthy Americans, the rate, But what that does, if they're saying it's revenue neutral, is actually raises the taxes of everyone else. I mean, right now, being able to write off your first mortgage is incredibly important to a lot of middle-class families. Taking that away is a huge impact. So the tax.
So when they want to lower the rates, revenue neutral, somebody is raising taxes.
Right.
They're raising
Exactly.
taxes on somebody.
Right.
And have you identified where that tax hike is coming from?
Well, they haven't identified it. They've just thrown out a target number, and if anybody credible has looked at it, it's very clear that in order to raise that kind of revenue that they would need to be revenue neutral from lowering the tax rate is going to require a lot of middle-class families to lose a lot of what they use as deductions.
You were just at a dinner with the president last week. I want to say you hosted all the 20 women senators. There's 16 Democrats, 4 Republicans in there. Nature of the conversation, how much of it was focused on the budget issue, and did you walk out of there any more or less convinced that a deal was going to happen this year?
Well, I was very impressed with the conversation that we had, the 20 women who had dinner with the
And you guys
president.
get together monthly. This is something the women of the Senate have been getting together this way ever since Barbara Mikulski started this a long time
20
ago.
years ago.
Yeah.
And it was a very good conversation. A lot of it was about the budget. And what impressed me the most is Republicans and Democrats alike in that room, and we run the range, liberal to very conservative, were very serious about the budget issue. And in that room, almost to a person, I think, said, I'm willing to take a tough vote if everyone does. That gives me hope. So I think if we put the 20 women into a room, we could probably come out with a deal.
I've heard this a number of times. I don't disagree on that. Last question, and it's sort of a silly out question, but if there is no deal this year, is it fair to say there's not a deal until after the next presidential election?
Well, look, here's how I'd answer that. The American public, all of us, are tired of management by crisis. It is hurting our businesses, it's hurting our families. And when I took on the super committee, the one thing I said was, I want to find a solution to the deficit problem, but I also want to show the American public that a democracy can work. If we are forced to another budget crisis manufactured way of getting to a budget deal, that's going to reinforce to the American public our country can't work. So I say let's not get there. We need to start working now in conference committee, in full transparency. The president is reaching out to a number of Republicans. He is looking for people who are willing to work with us. I'm hearing from Senate Republicans that they are tired of management by crisis. Let's show the country we can work. My door's open. I'm ready to compromise. I know Democrats are, and we are ready to work with our Republican
I'm tempted to just I believe Paul Ryan is next and waiting in the back room. I'm tempted to leave the seat. We should let you guys negotiate out there in public.
All right.
But I will say the double zeros are on the clock. Senator Patty Murray,
thank you
for coming, and thank you for sharing your views.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You got it. Coming up is the senator's counterpart in the House Budget Committee Chairman, Paul Ryan from Wisconsin.
Hey, Chuck,
Here he is. Congressman.
Nice to see you.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Okay, so what we learned from...
Morning.
Good morning. I'm going to start a little process. We'll get a little policy, and we'll end with a little process. And we'll start with...
So process, then policy, then back to process?
Yeah, you know,
Okay.
This is Washington.
Sounds
Come
exciting.
on now. Yeah, just what you love. When do the talks start? Democrats have said, Senator Murray said, they're waiting for you guys to send the negotiating table. She said that you want to meet with her one-on-one. But the regular order, Harry Reid last night tried to get it started. Senate Republicans blocked him on that. When does the clock start?
So we do want to go to conference, but we want to go to conference when we have a good chance of actually getting something done. The reason we think it's not, I want to get a deal. I want to get an agreement. We don't want to go to conference just for the sake of going to conference. We want to go to conference when we think we can get an agreement. The problem we experience, and this is more of a House thing than a Senate thing, is if we go to conference and have a months-long stalemate in conference, what ends up happening is people dig in their positions, and it makes it that much harder to get an agreement at the end of the day.
Is that your lesson from the super committee?
It is my lesson from the super committee. So know that our motivation is to actually get to an agreement. And the decisions we're making right now are to maximize the likelihood of getting an agreement at the end of the day.
Does that mean you believe that you guys passed too political of a budget and they passed too political of a budget?
Do I want my budget to become the law? Yeah. If Mitt and I won, we were planning on putting it together. But I get that in divided government, you don't get everything you want. And so we understand that. Let me give you an example. The president should get credit for putting chain CPI out there. Wasn't in our budget, wasn't in Patty's budget. He put it out there. Let's assume for the sake of argument that that might be part of a final deal. If we go to conference early, I can guarantee you'll see votes on the House floor prior to going to conference where virtually nobody votes for it, and it makes it that much harder for it to be part of a final agreement.
Well, so why? I mean, why would John Boehner, Eric Cantor, and Kevin McCarthy allow that to happen?
They wouldn't. The Democrats can get control of the floor when you have a conference after 20 days that hasn't come to an agreement.
So you think Democrats
we would surrender the majority. And so we think that we want to go to conference when we have a chance of getting a deal. And that means if you have a months-long stalemate where the two political parties are just fighting each other, then you make it that much harder to get an agreement. I'm not saying John Boehner and Eric Cantor would let a vote like that happen. They would lose control of whether that kind of a vote would happen or not. And that's why we want to make sure when we go to conference, we're going to get something done. And this is where we have such huge worlds apart. Patty was pretty clear about that.
Yeah.
Our budget balances. It takes 10 years to balance. And so I would argue from a Keynesian standpoint, we're not hurting growth by balancing in 10 years. The problem is the Senate budget and the president's budget never balances, ever. So we have a disagreement on whether we should even balance the budget. That's number one. Number two, both the Senate budget and the president's budget have large tax increases stacked on top of the $1.6 trillion of tax increases that have already occurred in law starting 5 months ago.
$1.6 trillion. Where do you get $1.6 trillion?
The Obamacare tax increases and the fiscal cliff tax increases.
I think that the health care tax increases are a little bit in dispute on some of those numbers, of whether that adds up to $1.6 trillion, but fair enough. So you're saying no more tax. This is, you can't start negotiations that have that on the table.
So they want to say, agree to raise taxes, and then we'll later maybe talk about some entitlement spending or some spending cuts, which we right now won't agree to any in principle. That is hardly a smart way to start negotiating.
The president did.
But not the people we're dealing with in Congress. So I'm not trying to get, a squalor here, but the point is spending is the problem. For the last 60 years, we've taken about 20 cents of GDP to spend for the federal government. By the time my 3 kids are my age, we'll be taking 40 cents out of the economy to spend for this federal government at that time. That is the problem. You need to reform entitlements. You need to get spending under control. And then when we see the other budgets offered, which is, let's take the president's budget, for example. Take the smoke and mirrors away. It's about a $1.1 trillion tax increase with nearly a $1 trillion spending increase. Both the Senate and the president's budget have net spending increases. They don't even propose to have net spending decreases. So that is a very different world from the one which we're operating off of, and we're very far apart. So what we're trying to do is have conversations where we can find common ground. I think you asked Patty, where does this exist? There's really one thing that I've seen in these budgets.
Of the three budgets?
Of the three budgets.
There's one piece of string, you think?
Yeah, means testing is the one stream of commonality. I don't think Patty put it in her budget, but on the president's budget, he does means testing for Medicare. Mm-hmm. We propose means testing for Medicare. That's about all you see with respect to common ground. The point is their spending cuts, which are very few, are outwashed or outbid by the massive spending increases. And so we want to say, let's agree that we're going to get spending under control. Let's agree on some entitlement reforms that may not affect current beneficiaries. We've never proposed that, but let's prospectively, so we can get this debt under control, and we can't even get an agreement in principle to begin talking about that right now.
What do you say to her? So there have been various studies on how to deal with this the fiscal issue, and all of them proposed higher tax increases than what the president what you guys ended up grudgingly coming to an agreement to at the end of last year.
So there was 800 and a trillion that people have thrown other numbers out.
There's 800 that have clearly, Speaker Boehner was willing to go at least another 200 billion. Where the president's number was, maybe it's another 400 billion, maybe it's another 600 billion, but it didn't seem, even in Washington numbers, didn't seem like we were far apart.
Yeah, two points I'd say. What they're saying is raise more taxes to spend for more spending. We don't like that construction. The second thing is we want growth. The one thing that seems to be missing in this conversation all too often is what are we doing to grow the economy? What are we doing to get people back to work? What are we doing to have faster economic growth so we have more revenues, which is one of the best things we can do to get this deficit under control, especially in the short run? And this is where we think tax reform is extremely important. And when you're talking about tax reform, something we're going to be moving through the Ways and Means Committee, something we're very serious about, something we would like to see in a final agreement.
You think that has to be part of the so-called grand bargain, whatever it is?
I don't think we're going to have a grand bargain. A grand bargain implies you're going to fix the problem. But when you have the majority party in Washington unwilling to embrace the kinds of reforms that make Medicare solvent or make Social Security solvent, which are the big drivers, Medicare is the biggest driver of our debt in the future, I don't see a grand bargain happening. So the question is, can we make divided government work, and can we get a down payment on the problem? Can we buy the country time and fiscal space? That's what we're shooting for. Something that's realistic. We don't want to overpromise and underdeliver, because I don't see a grand bargain happening. She said voucherize Medicare. That's not what our proposal does, but it's what pollsters say it is. We think premium support's a smart way to go. It's how the drug plan works today. It's what the federal employees have. We think that's a smarter way to save Medicare in perpetuity. There's no way they'll agree to it, I would imagine. And so that means comprehensive entitlement reform, which takes that unfunded liability off the books, gets this debt under control in perpetuity. Those kinds of ideas, I think, are not there.
Do you regret that basically, whether you believed you were doing it at the time or not, that you've essentially contributed to the demagoguing on Medicare when you guys ran against saying the president was trying to cut $700 billion out of Medicare? That whole, do you regret that conversation, because then it hurts your credibility as you're trying to have a Medicare reform conversation today?
Well, look, we never thought you should take money from Medicare to spend on a new entitlement. That's what we've been criticizing. If you look at my discussions of this issue, I never thought it was a good idea.
You kept the savings.
I never
in
thought
your budget.
I did, because it goes to Medicare. If you're going to take money from Medicare, it should go to Medicare solvency. You can't take $716 billion from Medicare, spend on creating Obamacare, and count it in two places. You can't count it for Medicare and then count it on Obamacare.
But you can make the argument that if you reform the health care system, it's going to help reform Medicare down the road.
That's not the argument that's being made. The argument that they're advancing is this money helps drive down the deficit and make Obamacare costless, and it extends the Medicare solvency. The Medicare actuary, the CBO, both told us you can't spend the same dollar twice. So the fiscal charade, the double counting, that's what we have a real problem with. If you're going to save money in Medicare, keep it with Medicare to extend Medicare solvency.
So you don't regret the language that was used? Because you said both parts of the sentence here. As you know, the campaign simply a lot of times shortcutted it and simply said, and there's the president trying to slash
So let me speak
Medicare.
to that issue.
And frankly, I've watched both parties do this.
Right.
Demagogue Medicare to their own.
Both parties
96 in Clinton, you guys in 2010 and 2012.
I'm not going to dispute that. The point I would say also is look at our budget. We think that there are problems with the Medicare provider community. We think that these provider cuts are going to lead to Medicare beneficiaries losing access to coverage. And so we put a provision in our budget saying we need to redress this. We need to look at where in the Medicare beneficiary network are we going to have inadequate coverage, and let's go back and look at that. So to the point that Patty was making earlier with where she has $275 billion, I think she said.
In Medicare as a target number, didn't say what it was.
Out of providers is what they're saying. That's on top of the 716, which we still think is going to basically effectively shut down the Medicare provider network. We see that as monopoly money. We see this idea that we're just going to keep price controlling Medicare providers to get all this savings as sort of a repeat of 1997. A bipartisan agreement, Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton came together. They put price controls on Medicare, and what we learned quickly after that was Medicare providers just stopped taking Medicare patients. So we did two subsequent agreements to give that money back to the provider network, and the savings did not materialize as they first envisioned. We don't want to repeat that mistake. The lesson we learned from
that. Is this the doc fix, by the way?
Doc fix was part of that. We call them the sniff cliffs for nursing homes and other things. The point I'm making is taking this entitlement, not reforming it, and then just putting price controls on providers does not work. And so we don't see that as real budget reform. We see that as sort of a phony exercise where we know as soon as providers stop dropping coverage, we'll put the money back so that they don't drop the coverage. And so we don't see it as real, lasting, bankable reform. The point I'm trying to get at is we want entitlement reforms that we know will stick, that we know will work, that we know will help reduce the unfunded liability we have in these programs, that will help get the debt under control. And back to my earlier point, we need economic growth. And this is why we're very serious about tax reform.
Do you think sequester is hurting the economy?
I don't think taking 2% off the top in a $14, $15 trillion economy is going to be a big drag on growth. I think in some sectors like defense, there are clearly dislocations that are occurring. This is why I passed 2 pieces of legislation, one in July, one in December, to have smarter spending cuts in other areas of government to make government more efficient to replace the sequester. You got to remember the House twice passed legislation saying the sequester is not smart, it's bad policy, we didn't insist upon it in the first place, and here are better spending cuts to replace the sequester. We stand by those cuts. We think those are smarter cuts. The problem is the Senate never followed suit. The president said, just give me a tax increase instead, which we think would have also been counterproductive with respect to the economy. But let me get back to this growth point, because just don't forget that. You need economic growth. And if we keep saying we'll just have what we call static revenue increases, that makes it really hard to get tax reform. And here's where we have differences as well. We're Patty, who I like Patty a lot. We have good, honest agreements with each other. They want tax reform as a means to growing revenue to the government. We want tax reform as a means to growing the economy, to getting people back to work. What that means to us is lowering tax rates, not closing loopholes and keeping high tax rates. It's closing loopholes in order to lower
open to lowering tax rates
on the corporations.
If there is revenue that is brought out of it, that
So-
seems to be.
So why don't we have the Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committees put together legislation, put together tax reforms, and see what those look like? That's something I think we should do. That's something that I think we should have that exercise.
So Max Baucus, Dave Camp, parallel track needs to start.
Go get them.
And
I
the
think
likelihood
right.
of that happening?
What's that?
The likelihood of that happening?
We're doing it in the House. We're moving forward. So we're going to lead on this issue
Baucus
in
and
the
Camp
House.
did do an op-ed, I want to say, about a month ago, claiming that they, and I think they're both genuine about it. He's in his last term at Ways and Means, Baucus in his last term. Is that going to get moving?
We want to. We're going to do it in the House, whether the Senate follows or not. We're going to move forward. Now, here's my point I'm trying to make on this.
Right.
The president says he wants to take the corporate rate down to 28%. Good idea. Problem is, that's only 20% of American businesses. 80% of American businesses aren't corporations. They file their taxes as individuals, subchapter S corporations, LLCs, partnerships. Their effective tax rate goes up to like 44% now with the January tax increase. That makes it pretty hard for them to compete internationally when the international tax rate on businesses is 25%. So this is why we take this very seriously. 9 out of 10 businesses in Wisconsin, they're not corporations. They're what we call pass-throughs. Right. So we want to get those tax rates down equally, not just the big corporations,
but you want to make it revenue neutral.
Small businesses.
You want to make it revenue neutral.
That's right, because in order to get the tax rates down where we need them to go to be competitive and internationally competitive, you need that fiscal space, plugging loopholes to get the rates down.
But if you do that, somebody's taxes are going up. Whose taxes are going up?
The people who lose their tax shelters.
And that's it.
And that's people in the high end who, people in the high end.
You're not messing with the mortgage thing. You're not messing with any of these other middle class.
Everything's on the table. Everything on the table, and this is what we say in the Ways and Means Committees. We're not going to take anything off the table because we think once we start getting in this game of picking winners and losers in the tax code, which is what the tax code does today, we won't have a good outcome.
Tax code's been that way for a long time.
Well, you know, in '86, Rostenkowski, Packwood, O'Neill, Reagan, Bradley, they came together and they got this done. That's the kind of thing we want to see happen again. We would like to think there's an opportunity for a bipartisan agreement on tax reform, which gets us growth. We would like to think we could get to a bipartisan agreement on entitlement reform, and that's the kind of agreement we want to see at the end of the day.
I am running out of time. I did have a Facebook question from you, from a Peter North of Massachusetts, and it was a one-off, but I am curious. Could you ever imagine, it's about lifting the income gap, the income cap on Social Security contribution. Can you ever imagine raising that or even creating a donut hole that raised it on more wealthier folks, on contributing more to, as a way to fix or make Social Security solvent for a longer period of time?
I think there's a better way to do it without economic problems, which is means test the spending, means test the benefit formula itself.
Doesn't sound like you're totally ruling out the idea of raising some of that.
When you lift the cap, you also pay out a benefit. You get 15 cents on the dollar at that level of income. And so where this conversation inevitably goes, I've been on a number of commissions that look at this, is, well, we should cut the benefit off. You know, if Aaron Rodgers is going to pay, you know, his FICA tax on all of his salary, and by the way, he should be the highest paid player in the NFL. He deserves to be.
Total common ground here, and there should be a resolution that's passed on that.
But then he'll have a huge benefit. Most policymakers say, well, that's not fair. Then cut that off. Then you turn it into a welfare program, and it's not like a social insurance program. Most of us want to make sure that this has the feel of a social insurance program and not a welfare redistribution program. Second point is, what about the self-employed person? What about the dentist with a few chairs? What about the farmer?
Right.
Their income tax rate goes up over 50%. Very bad for self-employed people, bad for economic growth. So the tax increases, I think, are the wrong way to go because it produces bad economic output. But let's focus on means testing the benefit formula itself. You can get the same kind of savings without doing devastation to the self-employed community or to jobs.
Not only have double zeros, but I'm also getting yelled at in a monitor that says I got to go introduce the next guy. So anyway, Congressman Paul Ryan, Chairman of the House Budget Committee. Thank you, sir.
You betcha.
Good to see you. Go Pack.
See you.
Our next guest is somebody who is not only a current senator, Ohio Senator Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio, but somebody who was the head of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, during the Bush administration. So somebody who's well-versed in budget issues, and we'll see where he stands. He's now chit-chatting and doing, I think, some green room negotiating with Paul Ryan there. But anyway, let me introduce Rob Portman. You get music. You get entrance music. Did you? It's sort of like at a baseball game. Do you have specific entrance music that you demand?
I had preferred a country music
Florida
song,
or something like that.
Best, yeah. Stairway to Heaven.
There we go.
Stairway to Heaven. That's another way to talk about the budget. Right?
Yeah. It's kind of like
Everybody wants to get there. No one wants to do what it takes to.
There it is. And we thought that Paul Ryan was the only heavy metal rock fan.
Yeah, I go.
Where,
across the board.
When does?
By the way, thank you for having me on. Gene Sperling is supposed to be speaking now. I apologize to those of you who are
You guys are
here
switching.
just for Gene. All the Gene fans are here. But we've got a vote in the Senate, so Gene kind of let me go ahead. He did say to me when he told me
Did you
that
threaten him when you sent him this email?
Well,
was this a threat?
When I was changing his schedule, he said, Rob, I'll do it, but you may regret this. And that's all I'm saying. But seriously, thanks to Gene. Now, Gene and I have done this before, this dog and pony show together, so I was interested in him going first because it's a lot more fun to criticize what someone else says about the budget than to actually come up with ideas. So.
Well, then there you go.
Yeah.
I want to start with the same question I've started with Senator Murray, and I don't have a good answer, which is nobody seems to want to start negotiating. Paul Ryan made it clear that they're not ready yet to start the conference process. They want to have sort of a side negotiation first. They don't think they're in a good place. The Senate Democrats, you were probably on the Senate floor last night and saw this exchange between Harry Reid and Ted Cruz, which got a little ugly there at the end about trying to start the negotiating clock. Why won't the clock start?
Well, I think there are two negotiations. One is the formal negotiation in a budget resolution, and given the budget that was passed in the Senate, I think the difference between the House and the Senate is so great that that's not likely to be successful.
You think that's not a useful exercise at this
Well,
point,
I think it's a useful exercise
different?
because I think we need reconciliation at the end of the process, but not having the President's involvement and having a more middle ground approach that the administration can bring to the table if they choose to would make it very difficult to make any progress on these two very different approaches to the budget. The real negotiation has to take place, in my view, between the President and those of us in Congress who want to get something done. And that is beginning.
I was just going to say, is that, all right, you've been, these dinners, President golfing with a couple of people that we assume would be part of this group of 16 or 20 of Republicans that seem to be.
Saxby-Chambliss got a hole-in-one yesterday, which means that there will be no tax increases, which I think is great, great news.
So they bet on that.
That was
what it was. That was
great for the economy. He actually asked me to golf with him, which was a huge mistake because I am so bad. I'm such a hacker.
The President had the three. From my understanding, Mark Udall, Saxby-Chambliss are the two best golfers in the Senate. Is that the truth to this?
Although Corker played well yesterday, they said. But he was really lucky I wasn't out there. And the course was lucky. I mean, a lot of divots.
So we have these 16 to 20 Republicans. This is how this process is going to go. Patty Murray and Paul Ryan are basically, they've got their budgets. They've done what they've had to do. But this process is between a group of you and the President?
No, I mean, I think everybody's going to be involved. I mean, in this town, you know, nothing happens behind closed doors, which is okay. This needs to be something that is transparent. At the end of the day, this is going to affect the lives of millions of Americans in fundamental ways. And so, you know, it's going to be a process. Everybody will be involved. Patty will be involved. Of course, Paul will be involved. But it requires presidential leadership. And, you know, I've talked about this before. But if you look back, whether it's tax reform, 86, or whether it's Social Security reform, 83, really the last two examples where we did something significant to try to improve the economy and deal with our, at that point, what seemed to be a huge debt and deficit problem, which, by the way, seems small relative to what we have now. It has always involved presidential leadership. It must. First, the president's got to ultimately be supportive in order to have it become effective and enacted. But second, the resources of the Office of Management and Budget that I used to head and the Treasury Department and so on are critical to this. So, you know, the president's got to step up and show leadership.
Well, did he not with this budget? Do you believe he did?
He started in a small way, and I think that's important. And as you know, I've talked a lot about that publicly and privately in our hearings we've had on the president's budget, talking about the fact that putting chain CPI on the table at all, I think, is a step in the right direction. Saying in the budget, for the first time, by the way, that the savings that come from reducing some of the preferences in the corporate tax code ought to go back into lowering the rate rather than being used for deficit reduction generally, I think was a positive step. That's in the budget for the first time. So I think you take those small steps in the right direction and you build on them. And look, the president's taken some heat from his side of the aisle on chain CPI.
And some members of the Republican Party seem to more interested in the politics of this. I mean, you had Chairman of the House Republican Campaign Committee, Greg Walden, say just that.
Yeah, and look, it's a more accurate measure of inflation. It's the right thing to do, in my view, from a policy point of view. In terms of the politics, there are Republicans who believe that we should wait until until we can have another election. Perhaps,
the last one wasn't good enough?
Perhaps getting a majority in 2014 in the Senate, perhaps getting a new president in 2016. I don't think the country can wait. I mean, I honestly believe that we're in trouble as a country, both in terms of the fiscal problem, but also in terms of our economy. And if we wait until 2017, which is in essence what that's saying, that attitude, I think we're taking a huge risk. And so I think we have to engage. And I'm not suggesting that...
How many people share your view in the Senate, in the conference, Republican conference?
Republican conference? I think the majority, honestly.
Do you?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think there are some who, you know, unlikely to be there almost no matter what. But there are others who are going to take a hard look at this who might surprise you. I mean, I think there are a lot of members who understand that this is a pivotal point in our nation's history. It's not just about getting through the debt limit. It's about dealing with what is otherwise going to be a huge impact on the people we represent, because our standard of living will go down, because we are risking a financial crisis that would make the one in 08 and 09 look relatively small. You look right now what's happening. You know, yeah, the stock market's looking pretty good. Wages are going down. I mean, so it's an economic issue, too. There's a real squeeze out there. Healthcare costs up, wages down. You know, people who are serious legislators on both sides of the aisle recognize that this is a pivotal point and we have to act. And by the way, if you think about it, in the past, dealing with issues like tax reform or entitlements, I mentioned 83 and 86, it tends to come with divided government. George Bush tried this, as you recall, with Social Security when there was a Republican Congress. It didn't get very far.
No.
In part because of the politics. They're tough. No question about it. It's that third rail of the New York subway system. You grab and you're electrocuted.
Right.
And if you grab it together, you sort of spread the shock a little bit. And that's the opportunity that I see really in the next several months here, and we've got to take advantage of it.
I've had some Senate Democrats, and I don't, not the Senate Democrat that was up here, but some Senate Democrats whisper to me, unnamed, say, don't Republicans realize they'll never have an easier negotiating partner on the other side of the aisle than President Obama? And in fact, they say this out of, some of that is out of fear. They think President Obama is going to be more of a compromiser than they would be in the Senate Democrats.
Yeah.
How many Republicans sort of either believe that that is true?
Well, Chuck, you and I may disagree on this, but the president had an opportunity with his own fiscal commission to step up. He chose not to. He rejected their recommendations.
You think if he endorsed Bowles-Simpson unequivocally at that time, owned it, and the only place to find it right now is on whitehouse.gov. I always like pointing that out to folks. But if he had endorsed that, owned it, do you really believe there would have been bipartisan support for it?
Life would have been very different. You had, as you know, senators, including all the Republicans who showed up to work on that commission, Tom Coburn being one, a very conservative senator, supporting it. I mean, it would have been very different.
A bunch of Republicans jumped off, didn't end up, that commission could have had teeth on it. That commission, the president had to appoint because a bunch of senators backed out.
Including some Democrats. But look, my point is this. If you look at this president's record in terms of his inability to show leadership on these issues, there's no wonder there's some skepticism. When Paul Ryan came out with his budget, instead of saying there's some tough stuff we can do here, this is the budget from last year, there was a frontal attack, you know, with Paul sitting in the front row. And so I understand the skepticism. It's a healthy skepticism. It's based on some of the previous actions of the administration or inaction. But I think those Democrats are making a point that we ought to listen to. And look,
Meaning you do buy into the idea that you probably have
well,
you might get a better deal from President Obama than you would from Harry Reid.
yeah, I mean, it's trust but verify, but not to even engage, I think, is a huge mistake. I mean, let's see whether he's serious or not. If he's sincere, I do believe we can do something significant. It may not be called the grand bargain, but folks, unless we get started, both on the economic growth side of this, which is, in my view, tax reform, and then also on dealing with this long-term problem, which is not going to be solved unless we get at the mandatory spending, which is now about 65% of the budget, growing at a faster rate than the rest of the budget. CBO just told us that Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, incredibly vital programs, and we've got to save them, but that they will grow at 95% over the next 10 years. They'll grow by almost double. They've also told us, by the way, that if we don't do something on the spending side, we'll go from about 22% of GDP today to about 39% in 3 decades. The historic average, as you know, is 20% over the last 50 years. You can't catch that with enough taxes. It's simply not possible. So when folks talk about balance, you ought to ask them, are they talking about revenues, which are now projected to be at 19%, spending at 39%? This is in a few decades. This is not, like next century. Are they talking about 29%? Is that the balance? If so, higher taxes by far, of course, we've ever had. More than doubling of all of your taxes. We couldn't get there, in my view, with 100% taxes on the wealthy, so we have to come up with a new tax form based on the historical data on what it was like when we had a 70% tax rate and so on. So when people say, like me, we've got to deal with the spending, this is, as Bill Clinton said famously at the Democrat convention in another context, it's math. I mean, this is not ideology.
But do you walk in, but speaking of ideology, I feel like I heard some from Senator Murray when it came to the issue of Medicare age, and I feel like I heard some of it from Paul Ryan when it came to the issue of taxes and revenue. Do you walk into this saying, I'm not going to be a part of any deal that includes any more tax increases?
No, I walk into it saying we've got to solve the issue, which is spending. And if there's a sincere effort on spending, and if we come up with some changes that are really structural changes to begin to bend the curve, and if we do tax reform, not just...
And it ends up raising revenue, and it ends up raising a little revenue, you can sign on to something like that.
Well, look, I mean, we'll see. I do think that...
See, we're making progress, right? We had one, right?
I do think that one of the factors we had to look at is behavioral changes, and therefore what people call macroeconomic or dynamic scoring. And as you know, in the budget debate in the Senate, I offered an amendment that was actually passed by the United States Senate that said, yes, we should have the benefit of looking at the dynamic score. Why did I want that so badly? Because both how you design tax reform and how you look at this issue in terms of revenue ought to include what the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation, not some of these outside groups, but what our internal analysis says in terms of what the macroeconomic impact is going to be. And it will show with regard to the business tax reform, which, as you know, I'm very focused on, because if we don't do this, we're going to continue to lose jobs and businesses overseas. And on the individual side, there will be revenue increase through growth. Now, the president's going to insist on some static scored revenue, he says, in order to do anything on entitlements. Those of us who are interested in getting to yes are going to have to look at that and look at it in the context of what other aspects of tax reform are going to help the economy. So this will be the discussion. And by the way, it is a discussion that has been taking place really for 5 or 6 years. You look at these other commissions.
I was just going to say, are we really that? I mean, I hate to say, I mean, it feels like we have. There's all these things on the shelf. You can just pick and choose. It's even a la carte, right? Oh, I like this from Alice Riven. I like this one from Alan Simpson. Is it that easy, you think?
It's not quite that easy, because there's a little thing in Congress called scoring. So, people say, gosh, just pick up this proposal. Well, when you go through the process, for instance, on tax reform, you've got to go through the Joint Committee on Taxation, and you've got to live by their score in order to legislate. So legislating is a little more difficult than coming up with a recommendation to commission. But having said that, there are a lot of good ideas out there. We're not lacking ideas, we're lacking political will, and I do believe that if we don't solve this problem, again, we put the country in great jeopardy.
All right, let me get a Facebook question in here, directed to you from Cynthia Coombs from Louisville, Kentucky. What policies can be put in place today that can help our country train and prepare a workforce for the jobs of tomorrow? So a little one-off in the conversation. Right. This goes into this larger debate about how government spends some money. Yeah. There is some joint agreement that government should spend some money on things like this.
Yeah. Look, one of the huge issues we face in our economy today is the skills gap. We have 400,000 people in Ohio looking for a job today. We have 100,000 jobs open. Why is that? It's primarily because those people who are looking do not have the skills to fill the 100,000 jobs that are open in Ohio. So people say unemployment's going down. Not really. If you look at the labor participation rate, if you just assume that the same labor participation, I mean people in the workforce are looking for work as when the recession began, we're at 11.3% unemployment.
Well, don't forget, some of this is a lot of this is demographics.
Some of it's demographic.
All right, I mean, we are an older aging pollen.
But that doesn't account for the lowest labor participation rate since 1979, since Jimmy Carter was president. So my point is there's a huge skills gap here. One thing the federal government can do that I'd love to have be part of this final agreement is to take the worker retraining programs that are done at the federal level, because we have between $15 and $18 billion a year, Chuck, that we're spending, and have it work much better to close that gap. Right now, there are 46 programs spread over 9 different departments and agencies, and the GAO has studied it and said there's all kinds of duplication, waste, inefficiency. I happen to have legislation on this with Mike Bennett, Democrat from Colorado, who's a former superintendent of education.
So do you feel like there is a way to consolidate this?
Oh, there is. Streamline, consolidate, put performance tests in place, ensure that the skills people are getting are actually needed in the region. There's all sorts of opportunities here for the federal government to partner better with the states. This is one of 4 or 5 things that this country needs to do right now to avoid us from continuing to fall behind in terms of the economy.
I'm just curious, where should this be housed? You know, everything has got to be housed somewhere in the government.
Well,
is this something Labor Department, is Education
most of it's
Department?
at Labor with we have the Workforce Investment Act and TAA, Trade Adjustment Assistance, and that's good. That's fine. But it should be something that is not spread over all these other departments and agencies, and there are opportunities here for us to get people to work right away if we provide that training.
Two out questions. Debt ceiling looks like September, October.
Yeah.
Is it going to be a crisis when it comes up? And if so, do you actually need it? Is it going to be needed as the trigger to force the talks?
Yes.
So it is going to be a crisis and it's needed.
Yes.
So you're of the mindset that could be the forcing mechanism to the big deal.
Well, look, I've heard the president say, we should take this, out of the political equation and just extend the debt limit and then deal separately with this. I will tell you that over the last 3 decades, it's the only thing that has worked. Think about Graham Rudman. That was the rescission. Some of you, there's no one in this room old enough to remember Graham Rudman, I can see, but it came out of what?
No, we want to pretend there's nobody in this room old enough to remember Graham Rudman, that's all.
A debt limit discussion.
Yeah.
Think about the 1990 budget deal that some criticize, that George H.W. Bush put in place. What did that come out of? A debt limit crisis, as did the 97 agreement, the balanced budget agreement in 1997. So I would argue that every single one of the half-dozen proposals that have actually worked to reduce spending in Congress in the last 3 decades has come out of this same process. Why? Because the American people do not like to extend the debt limit. Why? Because they get it. It's like a credit card. You've overextended on your credit card. Now you're going back to Congress and saying, because you have to, under statute, please extend that. Well, what the American people say is, deal with the underlying problem, like I'd have to do in my home or my business when my teenager maxes out on his or her card. And so it's a good leverage point because the American people get it, because they don't want us to extend it without dealing with the underlying problem. I think this will be a positive way for us to focus people's attention come whatever it is, September, October.
And it's this year. This year is deal or bust.
I think it is. I think it's very difficult to imagine in 2014, which is an election year, making much progress. It's possible. We've done things in an election year before, but it's going to be difficult.
And when we have this summit next year, we're going to be talking about the deal?
I hope we're talking about implementation of something that we have agreed to early this fall. And I hope we're talking about the fact that we now have some bending of this curve that is otherwise going to bankrupt the country. There's no question about it. And I hope we're talking about an economy that's starting to improve because people see they have more certainty with regard to pro-growth tax reform, because we're dealing with some of these issues like worker retraining we talked about, and that America gets back on track.
Senator Rob Portman, Republican.
Thanks, Todd.
From Ohio.
Good to see you.
We'll leave it there. I bring out Gene Sperling. He's chairman of the President's National Economic Council, and he comes out now a man of many budget wars, a veteran of many budget wars. Mr. Sperling, you are the last word here on this.
My privilege.
You are on the White House side of things, meaning you are aware, probably aware of where the levels of conversation are, and I'm going to start with basically the same question I've started with everybody else. What's the status of talks? Have they truly begun? between the president and Senate Republicans. That seems to be where everything this is headed. Is it fair to say it's formally begun or not?
I would say that what you've seen the president do is do everything he can to create the conditions for a bipartisan agreement. And you see that by the fact that he was willing to keep his offer to Speaker Boehner on the table, even put it in his budget, even after the Speaker had pulled it back. You've seen it in the outreach that he has done to Senate Republicans and really to anyone he thinks would be part of what he calls
And is he throwing golf games now? Is that what this has come down to? He's going to throw golf games?
I think that if people ask, are we doing enough? I think the fact that we are arranging for Republican senators to get holes in one when they play golf with the president.
It's amazing the power. I'd like it a little.
I don't know
like
what more you expect us to do.
Yeah.
And it's a 1-on-1-1 11 hole. I mean, it was an extraordinary effort, but it shows that we are taking very seriously, doing everything we can to create those conditions. And I think that these dinners and the conversations have been important because they've built trust. The Republican senators have seen the president's very serious. They've seen that he is willing to compromise, that he's willing he's showing political courage and putting out things that he doesn't necessarily even want to have, particularly in his budget, but he's showing that willingness to compromise. I do think that, and you had this conversation earlier, that you'd heard quite a lot before about the importance of returning to regular order. Right. As you remember, I think when I'm often being interviewed on cable TV, I used to get, if only the Senate would pass a budget.
1,004, whatever it is, right.
Heard it so many times.
Right.
So here you've had that take place. They even conditioned the debt limit extension on it. And so we have a chance to actually have a conference committee like we teach our kids in their U.S. government classes it's supposed to work. And yet you don't even see a willingness to appoint conferees. But I think what we're doing is obviously we're calling for regular order, but the president is engaged in the conversations that I think soften the ground, create the conditions for an agreement. And that's not, and I think, the importance of what you saw in his budget is that it's not just about having quiet conversations. He has shown that he is willing to go out of his comfort zone, to put forward a real compromise, to take heat even from his own side, understanding that in divided government, if we're going to get a balanced agreement, it is going to require both sides to get less than 100%, both sides to be willing to tell their supporters that we have to compromise to do something positive to move the country forward. I mean, one thing I think it's important to recognize is how nonsensical the status quo is right now. I mean, everyone has said it, but it's true. You have a sequester that was designed by both sides to be so stupid that it wouldn't take place. Speaker Boehner had said it would be devastating. And then people say, well, I think the Republicans' leadership may be satisfied with the status quo. But on what substantive grounds? They have always argued for a stronger defense budget. This has a harsh defense cut that lasts for 10 years. They argue for stronger border security. This cuts border security. Some of them support more biomedical research. This is $1.5 to $2 billion a year in cuts to NIH. And this is the most important point I want to make, which is what you hear when you come to a Pete Peterson forum is a focus on how we as a country are going to deal with the challenge of the baby boom retirement. So the question to ask is, what does the sequester do for the second decade of savings? And the answer is, it is a big zero. I think it's important for people to understand that. This cuts the domestic part of our budget, which is already about to be the lowest it's been as a percentage of our economy since the 1950s. It would cut this severely, even though that's where a lot of our investments in children and innovation and research are. And then it has a small cut in entitlement savings, which, and this is important, ends exactly on the 10th year. It goes away. So when you look at the sequester, somebody says they're serious about long-term entitlement savings, but they think the status quo is acceptable. They're for an approach that would have zero savings in the second 10 years, compared to the president's approach, which would have $1 to $2 trillion of entitlement savings in the second decade.
Well, as you know, a big deal happens in Washington when there is a political reward for both sides at the end. Is it fair to say when you see how Republicans, they're not paying a political price on sequester as far in their own districts. They don't believe that they are. Doesn't that tell you that this sort of the politics of spending has changed in such a way that the Republicans are just going to be in another place?
Well, you know, again, I don't understand what substantive goal it serves for them. Again, this is cutting into areas that they have long argued were priorities for them. It's done in an arbitrary way. You know, you've heard both Paul Ryan and Rob Portman talk about growth. There is not a single independent economic forecaster out there, or not one I've seen, that does not think the sequester is costing us hundreds of thousands of jobs, costing us economic growth. We're at a point where we should be, where our economy recovery is showing some strength in the housing side. We could be taking off. Instead, we're putting a brick on the economy. So why should people be satisfied with an approach that was designed to be so stupid nobody could live with it, that's hurting jobs, that's hurting economic growth? You know, one can take that position, but I don't understand it. And I do believe that there are military communities in many people's districts and other places, people getting Meals on Wheels, Head Start programs that are hurting. And I'm not sure that people aren't hearing that. But it is true, as you know, Mitch McConnell once says, it takes two to tango. And the president can create a conditions, and he can do outreach for a serious bipartisan balanced agreement that can help alleviate this, remove this sequester and have a more balanced approach of long-term entitlement savings and revenue from tax reform. But, you know, again, it takes two to tango. The president has shown real political courage and leadership in what he's been willing to put out. But if we don't see some of that same leadership and courage from their side, it's going to be very hard for us to do anything about that. And we understand that's the reality we face.
What did the president mean when he said the other day that there needs to be a permission structure for the Republicans to get on board? It was an interesting phrase that he used, that he was asked about the dinners and all this, but it seemed that we're sort of kind of still in this stalemate. And he said he was trying to create this idea where there has to be a permission structure for Republicans to get on board.
Well, I think in divided government, when you have a budget agreement, and you're right, I've been part of this. I was one of the negotiators in 1997. You know, deficit reduction is never easy. It's never fun. It requires hard choices. And when you have divided government, whether it's 1997 or now, it requires compromise. And I think what you need, though, is for both sides to be able to feel that they achieved enough of their objectives, that the compromise in the areas they don't like is acceptable because the plan as a whole is balanced. What we care about, and I think many progressive Democrats care about, is that you want a plan that's going to be good for jobs and growth now, because we need this recovery to strengthen to help alleviate long-term unemployment, help middle-class families. You need a budget agreement that allows us to still invest in the future. And you need something that, while it will have long-term entitlement savings, isn't putting all the burden on seniors and middle-class families, that it's balanced, that includes some revenue savings from the most high-end individuals. And I think if it has that kind of balance, it is easier for a Democrat to go along with perhaps some measures that they would normally oppose. Likewise, I think what you've heard when you listen to Senator Portman and others is that while they may prefer to not have any additional revenues through tax reform, if the agreement is serious enough about long-term entitlement savings, such as in the second decade, as we spoke about, that I think that for them becomes acceptable. Even if they would prefer not to have revenues, they hopefully, many of them on both sides, recognize that everyone's got to give a little, everyone's got to compromise their position a little, so that we can have an honorable agreement that's good for growth, good for the middle class, good for the confidence that comes from showing we're dealing with our long-term entitlement challenge.
Is there a part of the Ryan budget that you could, and specifically the Medicare plan, that the president could adopt?
Well,
Except, you know, in a larger deal.
Well, you know, if you look at
and yes, I'm trying to have a negotiation now, open the air. Yeah.
Well,
just what you guys hate.
You know, we've always thought this negotiation would happen with you.
I understand.
So I've come ready.
I appreciate it.
But I'll be very specific. December 3rd, Paul Ryan, Speaker Boehner, Majority Leader Cantor write the president a letter saying that if we're going to accept $800 billion in revenues, or we'd be willing to do $800 billion in revenues if you took this deal that Erskine Bowles had suggested to the super committee. And that deal basically called for three things. It called for raising the Medicare retirement age, it called for CPI, and it called for means testing Medicare. I do think that the president, and then the minority leader, McConnell, called for those same three things twice in November and then on his first appearance on Meet the Press in January. If you look at what the president has done, he has put forward in his budget two of their explicit requests. Means testing the premiums on Medicare for couples over 170,000, and also accepting their request that we have the CPI change in the budget. And you see that obviously that's been very tough, and some of our own supporters have expressed opposition to that. So I do think that the president has shown a willingness to go at least halfway. But one thing people don't recognize enough is that when the president puts out in his budget $400 billion in specific savings in Medicare, and then you say, how does that compare to Paul Ryan's budget? I don't know how to answer that because they don't have any details of how they get any savings in the first 10 years. None. So we hear a lot about, are you for structural reform? Well, the president says, here's $400 billion. This includes asking high-income premiums on well-off seniors. It does call for new beneficiaries to have some better incentives in their beneficiary structure. So we've got details on the table. There's now time for the Republicans who are serious to come back and start saying what it is they want and what are the conditions.
You believe they owe you a deal. They owe you a new piece of paper. That you guys have, if we're doing a ping pong game here a little bit, you guys have put out your public ping pong. You've done your shot. CPI, they owe you something in return.
I think that even some of them recognize that to some degree the ball is in their court, even if it's a private communication. And look, you know, of course I've heard the speaker and others say, well, the president got his revenues. But let's be honest. The speaker was at $1 trillion in revenues in December, $1 trillion. So it is true that $620 billion was raised by restoring the rates to the Clinton rates. But even by their last offer, they have nearly $400 billion in revenues on the table. It's not as much as the $580 billion the president has asked for. But the fact is, there shouldn't be this absolutist position from them that you can't have any revenue because they've already expressed.
Do you think they want to do a deal?
What's that?
Do you think they want a deal?
Look, I've kind of given up on trying to read minds and motives and incentives. I think that
you'll regret it if you do.
I do think. Let's just stipulate that I'm a very intimidating and threatening person, and then we can go on. Look, I think that I have conversations with Republicans who I think are sincere about being willing to compromise. I think they want to see a significant commitment to the type of entitlement savings as part of a deal. I think that they understand that to get an agreement in divided government, that means that tax reform would have to raise some revenue to contribute.
Do you buy this idea, though, that you can lower rates and raise revenue?
Well, I think it's difficult, but I think, you know, you said what the president has done is he has put out explicitly how he would raise $580 billion through two reforms, the Buffett rule and having a 28% deduction limit. Right. So he has shown how you could do it in a way that is reform and he feels is fair to the middle class. But he's always been clear that he doesn't claim to have all the good ideas in the world. And if the Congress was to come back in a bipartisan way with a tax reform that raised that amount of revenue and met his basic fairness goals, that he's open to other ideas. Now, can you raise that much revenue for deficit reduction and still raise enough to lower rates? It's very difficult, but the president's never put that off the table. I do think when you look at what the House Republicans are talking about, going down to 25%, and that has two problems. One, everything that Chairman Ryan said today, unfortunately, all left the line that there couldn't be a single penny of revenues, which is not going to help us lead to a bipartisan agreement. But also, I think as we saw from the report from the Brookings Urban Institute over the summer, if you have to lower rates that much on the top 1%, you can't cut their expenditures enough to pay for it. So you'd have to actually raise taxes on middle-class families. And I think if they were to put forward a plan like that in detail, have it scored, have people understand it, I don't think it would do very well.
The debt ceiling, you heard Rob Portman say, there's no choice. Debt ceiling, I know where the president stands on this. He said it's not he's not going to use it. He's not going to be forced to negotiating. You having the debt ceiling be a negotiating mechanism. How is it not inevitable?
Look, the president's been very clear. He's not negotiating on the debt limit. He believes that the era of anyone threatening...
Though arguably he's done it twice. Well, I mean, BCA in 11, and even the end of the year, the idea of negotiating the debt, I mean, there has been negotiation through it in some form or not, has it not?
There was in 2011, and what we saw was how harmful that was. The idea that the United States, and all that we've done over 200 plus years since Alexander Hamilton to build up our credit rating, our full faith in credit. I think that when the president saw what happened in 2011, saw the hit to confidence, the hit to the economy, the hit to our standing, I think he made the right decision, which is that he's simply not going to negotiate on the debt limit, that no one should ever threaten the default of the United States as a way of getting their budget goals.
So you're not interested in having it as a trigger to force budget talks?
No, because no one, Democrat or Republican, for any reason should ever use the default of the United States as a budget tactic or a negotiating tool. And I also want to make clear that this very bad piece of legislation that may be coming through the House called prioritization is, prioritization is default by another name. It is not a proposal to prevent default. It is a proposal that says, who do you pay first when you are in default? It's the equivalent of telling, a relative, it's okay if you pay your mortgage, it's okay if you default on your student loan, your car loan, and your credit card. The United States, when we talk about our full faith in credit, we mean that the United States of America meets its obligations. And the idea that it would be okay for us to meet our obligations to bondholders, but then default to veterans, to Medicare recipients, to small business contractors, is completely unacceptable, and no one should think that is anything other than default by another name.
What's your level of confidence that a big deal actually gets done? That he signs a big deal piece of legislation on the budget that sort of punts a new battle for 5 or 10 years?
I know, and I'm so good at this that I would get it exactly right, but then there'd be so little for people in your profession to do.
I mean, is it a better than 50-50 chance, or no? Or are you less optimistic than that? What's realistic?
I think all we can do every day, I mean this, is wake up and do everything we can to create the conditions for that type of
And this
agreement.
is the last chance. This 5-month period is realistically the last chance.
Well, I think historically,
in this presidency.
Look, I'm not going to make 2-month or 3.5-year projections. I think historically, as we saw in '97, the first year of a president's second term is a good time for people to come together and make hard choices that are good for the country. And again, you've seen this hasn't been abstract. You've seen the president out there willing to accept things they need for a budget agreement that he doesn't necessarily agree with. You've seen him show the political courage of doing things that many of his own supporters disagreed with. I think that what's been important about the outreach is that people understand that he's having private conversations. Senators can call the White House, Republican senators, and the door would be open to Republican House members too, to have private conversations. So people know that whether we've reached that deal space or not, they understand that the president's serious. He's about getting something done. He's willing to compromise. And I think what he's doing is, in a period of dysfunction where we have this harmful sequester, he's showing the country that there's another way forward.
Gene Sperling, president of the chairman of the NEC.
No promotion right now.
No promotion yet. Yeah. Maryland Congressman Chris Van Hollen, Democrat. The ranking member on the Budget Committee with Paul Ryan.
You took a... Hey, Chuck.
I was...
How you doing?
Pleasantly
you thought you were going to get away.
You know.
Well,
no.
After this morning, you got an invitation to join the Budget Committee if
apparently
it's not too much pain.
A few. So there was a proposal right before the last recess that said the conference committee between the two budgets was going to be Paul Ryan, a Republican of his choice, you, Patty Murray, Ron Wyden, and Jeff Sessions on the Republican side, and that the six of you were going to start getting together. Where does that stand? Is that even a plausible beginning scenario for how the House and Senate begin this reconciliation process?
Well, we'd like to do that, Chuck. We meaning Patty Murray, who's asked to go to conference. Democrats in the House and the Budget Committee, we want to go to conference. That is the next step. You know, Republicans justifiably complained that the Senate didn't have a budget for 3 years. Now they have a budget. You have a House budget.
You say justifiably complained. That was a mistake.
In other words, I think it was a fair point. I mean, to say, the Senate should come up with a budget. That was a fair point. They said it everywhere in the country. That was their big talking point. Now, the question we've got is whether they preferred that as a talking point or whether they actually really want to get a budget, because they made a big deal about no budget, no pay. But the reality is we still don't have a budget. We're now past the April 15th deadline in statute for Congress to complete conference committee action. Again, they made a big point about the president's budget being late. We're now in violation of the congressional deadline.
What does this mean? Do you guys lose your pay?
Well, we're going to have to press our Republican colleagues on this, but we should go to conference. I mean, I think people expect us to take the next step in the process. And we've been waiting. They keep saying, well, they want to have these conversations. But I can tell you that that's really not happening right now.
Well, let me get you to respond to Paul Ryan. He said that I guess he was implying that the environment's not ready for the conference, that it would just... that he believes that, for instance, the president's chain CPI initiative, there would be a massive bipartisan resolution voting it down because of the way the conference process works, and that once you start that clock, it could make the process harder. What do you say in response?
My response is the clock is ticking right now. There's no evidence that we are getting any closer to agreement. And so going to conference and beginning the clock ticking is a little bit of an action forcing mechanism. People will begin to say, okay,
but why should Republicans negotiate with you and Patty Murray if the president's deal is already a better deal?
Well, the reality is that what happens in conference will include any ideas that have been raised by the White House or others. It's not as if the White House is somehow excluded entirely from the conference process. I mean, obviously, they're an important player here. Gene Sperling just talked about the ideas the president put on the table. But what's ironic, they talk about how the president has changed CPI. It was their idea, and they don't have it in the Republican budget. So you're going to conference with a Republican budget that didn't have chain CPI, even though this was their request. I mean, look, this is why I think it's important just to have a structure to force the conversation. And we shouldn't be using the debt ceiling, for example, and playing around and negotiating with our full faith and credit, as Gene Sperling said. We should be using the budget process.
So if you have regular order, what does that do to the president working with Senate Republicans? Does it help your cause, hurt your cause, or is it just a separate track?
No, I think it's a parallel track that then can feed into that conversation. As you mentioned, you got Jeff Sessions, you've got other Republicans who are on the Budget Committee in the Senate, obviously working with Paul Ryan in the House. So it's a forum for that conversation to take place. And as I said, it's a little bit of an action forcing mechanism because, number one, it happens in public. That doesn't mean people can't continue to have conversations and negotiations. But I think it would be a useful way to finally get people's minds focused.
But these budgets are so far apart. How does it even begin? Let's say we went to conference, and you sit there, and I mean, you know, it is, to use the cliche, one budget's for Mars and one budget's for Venus. I mean, it doesn't seem as if we're maybe we're in the same universe, but not the same.
Well,
planet.
they are far apart. There's no doubt about it. I mean, they're as far apart as they've been before. I think that it.
But how does the conference process work?
Well, I think actually it would benefit the country and maybe force the parties to come closer together by having to put these arguments out in the light of day. After all, our Republican colleagues said for a long time they didn't want to have these backdoor conversations. I heard Rob Portman talk about presidential leadership. Let's remember that in December, after the Speaker decided he couldn't bring back a package that would get a majority of his own party in the House, he said he didn't want to meet with the President one-on-one anymore. So I think that having that conversation in public, reinforced by whatever conversations people want to have, could be useful. Now, look, one of the main impediments to moving forward, obviously, has been the Republican position on revenue. And they have taken the position that you cannot close one tax loophole, eliminate one tax break for the purpose of reducing the deficit. That every dollar you raise in terms of eliminating tax break has to go dollar for dollar into reducing the rates or some other break. It would be as if Democrats said, okay, we agree that this is not a high priority spending program, so let's cut that spending program, but you know what? You got to backfill that spending dollar for dollar. Why should tax expenditures, which are a form of spending through the tax code, get a totally different treatment in these negotiations? And yet that's obviously been an impediment. Look, as Gene pointed out back in December, the Speaker said, number one, he would do $1 trillion in revenue. He also said he had a plan to raise $800 billion by eliminating tax breaks. He said he had a plan. I would like to see that plan, because that plan raised revenue not by raising the rates, but by eliminating certain tax expenditures. So,
you think that's possible?
Mr. Speaker, you know,
do you think that's possible?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if you had a plan in December,
do you believe it's
why don't
possible
you put it forward?
To raise $800 billion and lower rates the tax code, pre the $600 billion? Do you think that's a?
Is it possible to both lower rates and raise that amount? Oh, I think that actually is possible. The issue, of course, is how much you're going to lower rates by. And after all, there's a lot of running room between $800 billion, which they said they could raise, and $4 trillion, which they claim they can eliminate in terms of tax expenditures to reduce the tax rate to 25%. Remember, they say they can reduce tax expenditures by approximately $4 trillion to buy down the rate from 39 to 25%. So certainly you can generate $800 billion through tax reform. How much you can lower the rate by and still generate, you know, is another question. But we'd like to see it. In other words, put your own plan that you had in secret on the table. That would be part of the conversation. Can you
support the President's Chain CPI initiative and the means testing on Medicare? Two things that are not in this.
Well, the issue with Chain CPI is it's presented as a more accurate measure of inflation. So to the extent that's true, as a policy matter that makes sense. The problem is, as it relates to seniors, there's a lot of evidence that suggests it's not true, because seniors they use a greater share of their income on health care. Health care generally has been rising faster in terms of price than other goods in the economy, and therefore they end up paying a higher share of income, higher inflation. So that's kind of a factual question. That's a concern as it relates to seniors. Other parts of the Chain CPI, which also help reduce the deficit, it seems to me make sense. In terms of Medicare, look, on Medicare, Part B has already got a lot of means testing. The President has proposed some additional modest means testing. That's certainly something that can be looked at. There are other proposals the President's made. But our fundamental difference in approach between on Medicare has been Paul Ryan has his voucher idea, which we believe doesn't help contain rising healthcare costs. We believe that just transfers rising healthcare costs onto the backs of seniors, whose median income is $22,000, versus the approach we took in the Affordable Care Act, which begins to move us away from a strictly fee-for-service system into one that rewards providers based on quality of care and can help reduce healthcare costs. In fact, there's some very good news recently that maybe healthcare costs per capita are actually rising more slowly now than at any time in the last 50 years. Part of that's due to the slow economy. Part of that may be due to some changes in the way people practice medicine.
Why should Republicans negotiate, though, with you and Patty Murray? I mean, there's this whispering I hear among Democrats who, while both exasperated with Republicans, also are nervous and say, it's amazing they don't see that they'll get a better deal from the president than they'll ever get from Senate or House Democrats. Is that a fair?
Well, look, I think that all the ideas should be in the mix. What comes out at the end of the day is got to be part of a negotiating process. But I think the president recognizes. Let me first say there's a lot more in common between the Senate Democratic budget, the House Democratic, and the president's budget than is different. Including a major upfront investment in infrastructure, replacement of the sequester, and a balanced approach to long-term deficit reduction. So with the exception of the items that you just mentioned,
not small
especially
items.
change CPI, there's not which of course, as I said, is not in the Republicans' own budget, is not a significant, they're not significant difference. So I think that we could come to some agreement. Now, in terms
So
of
basically, you can envision reluctantly supporting change CPI, some of this stuff on Medicare, if it's part of a larger deal.
I said I didn't say that, but I said that we would look at all the elements in the president's budget and look at all the elements certainly in our budget, and obviously the Republican budget is on the table for discussion. But we need to take the next step in the process, go to conference.
Why doesn't the Democratic budget balance, and should it? Do you believe in a balance? Should the federal budget be a balanced budget?
Well, I think our priority, our absolute priority, has to be economic growth, right? In the short term and in the longer term. And that needs to remain our focus. And if balance can then be a byproduct of that, and if you look at the House Democratic budget, it significantly reduces our deficit as a percent of GDP in the 10 years. And actually, our budget, because of what we believe are lower per capita healthcare cost growth in the future, actually did balance in the year 2040, which, by the way, and I think everyone needs to recognize this, the Republican budget last year, when did balance? In 2040. So this new notion that somehow 10 years from now is a magic number is totally inconsistent with the budget they had on the table last year. The other point I would make on this, Chuck, is that, there is this sort of super gimmick in the Republican budget that allows it to get the balance in 10 years, which is they repeal all the benefits of Obamacare, but keep in their budget all the other components of Obamacare that they railed against. Taxes. So $1 trillion in revenue in their budget comes from the Affordable Care Act. And if they don't get it from there, they haven't said where else they're going to get it. And $715 billion is the Medicare savings that they railed against in the last election. You take out the $715 in Medicaid savings and the $1 trillion in revenue, and their budget is more than $500 billion out of balance 10 years from now. So we need to keep these things in perspective. Our focus needs to be getting the economy going right now, replace the sequester, adopt the president's infrastructure proposal, and then act now to reduce our long-term deficit in a steady, sustainable way through a balanced mix of targeted cuts, reforms, and revenue from tax reform.
You said last week that there's significant progress has already been made in long-term deficit reduction. Do you believe we are in a crisis, a moment of crisis, or not?
I don't think we're in an immediate deficit crisis today, no. In fact, I think the main crisis right now is a jobs deficit. We continue to have high unemployment rates. And the Congressional Budget Office has said if you look at next year's deficit, 3/4 of next year's deficit is a result of the fact that we have high unemployment. In other words, the economy is not at full potential, lots of slack in the economy. So we need to do things to help get the economy going, certainly do no harm, so replace the sequester. But yes, should we act now to reduce the long-term deficits? Yes, if you look at the out years, especially because of demographic shifts, over time it will become unsustainable if we don't take action. But we do in our budget. And the president's budget gets the deficit down to about 1.7% of GDP 10 years from now, stabilizes the debt. And can we do better? Yes, but let me just say this in closing. Because of sort of artificial budget rules, we focus on 10 years. I mean, there's no magic in 10 years. I mean, someone could have picked 5 years from budgeting. Someone could have picked 15. The real issue is to take, in terms of the long term, take actions now that phase in over a period of time.
Should we be doing
in a
two-year budgets,
steady,
by the way?
credible way, and that would help us focus on the real issue.
You talk about we do these 10-year projections, but we do a budget every year. Can the system handle that? Should it be every 2 years at a minimum?
You're right. Well, first of all, as you know, we haven't gotten a budget.
Right. No, we keep going CR to CR to CR.
So
right.
in that sense, we haven't had a budget.
Maybe every 5 years.
There's also the issue of
I
could support something like biennial budget. I don't feel strongly one way or another on that. Appropriations process, it would give them a little bit more predictability. If they could do things on a
appropriators really want that.
Yeah. But the more I look at the budget process stuff, while some of it can help on the margin, it's no substitute for an agreement on these big substantive issues.
Is it fair to say if a deal doesn't happen this year between the president and Republicans, the deal doesn't happen until 27? We're on this hamster wheel for another 4 years.
I think it's much harder. I think it's much harder because, right now you would hope that there's enough pressure on both sides to try and get an agreement. I'm not sure that there is, but I hope there's enough interest in coming together right now. And as you know, the president's working it hard. We'd like to go to conference. We should do that right away. The president continues to have this dialogue with members of the Senate.
Chris Van Hollen, ranking member for House Democrats on the Budget Committee.
Thank you for having me. All right. Thanks, brother.
There we go. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.